So, Gareth, can we start with your role as a deputy director in the strategy unit? You were in the Prime Minister's strategy unit after the 2001 election.
That's right.
Blair had been returned for a second term, and you started working on pensions reform then. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I was brought into the strategy unit originally on secondment from PwC by Jeff Mulgan, and there was a desire at the time, because up to then I think the sense was that Blair had not been particularly involved in welfare policy, pensions policy. It had been very much seen as sort of Treasury-led, Treasury-dominated agenda. However, at this time there was a series of big private pension collapses over the period, and this has been a period when a number of people who had paid into their pension for 20, 30 years, typically in manufacturing firms, thought they had a guaranteed pension, suddenly turned around and found there was no guarantee at all. So this was becoming a big political issue that Blair in particular was very focused on. So the idea was we're going to do a green paper looking particularly at private sector pension provision. However, and we've all been involved in these sorts of green papers, there was no political agreement actually about the problem, let alone the diagnosis and the solutions. I think, and I was probably slightly further away from the real political conversations at that point, there's no real sense, the Treasury didn't want to get into it. They saw this as a potential backdoor for opening arguments on the pension dividend change rules that Brown had brought in back in, I think it was 97, 98. So they're very keen to sort of manage the issue down and saw it very much as an issue around corporate governance and the resolution regimes of our companies going into insolvency. So it was one of those classic green papers where no one agreed on actually doing it, let alone what the problem was. And it became, I call it, sort of classic Frankenstein green paper. Everyone sort of stapled together old favourite bits of text about demographics and how we're all living longer and the pension, went nowhere. It was an awful green paper, and it was summarised by, and the problems with it was shown by, we promised it for, I think it was autumn 2002. We published it the last day of Parliament in December, I think it was like 21st of December 2002. And it said next to nothing. I think it got panned. Had a couple of interesting things in there. Had the Pension Protection Fund. We managed to get that through. So there were some bits in there that I think I've seen the test of time. But there was a general sense of unfinished business. And when we were doing the wash-up with Carey, Derek Scott, and Jeff at the time, we all felt this was really unfinished business. The one thing we managed to get into the green paper was the commission for Turner, and this was also this is the sort of the last minute brokering, and it really was while we're at the printers. Jeremy Hayward was obviously PPS at the time, and he was thinking, well, okay, we're not going to solve it through this green paper. This is unfinished business. How do we get some form of process in place that we can actually really address some of the fundamental issues here? And it was in the last probably week, 10 days of the green paper, and we'll all remember those sort of late night processes where you're haggling over bits of text, and you can tell the sort of last minute nature of it, because if you go back to the actual published document, the commission, the terms of reference for the Turner Commission were put in a very random chapter because it was the last bit of space we had in the typeset text, and that was basically the genesis of the Turner reform. And
why was Adair Turner chosen to lead the commission? Can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, so you can imagine a normal sort of great and the good that we went through. Turner was, everyone recognised, pensions, horrifically complex issue. So you needed someone who was sharp, able to really grapple with the technicalities of it. Someone who had credibility across a wide political spectrum. To be absolutely frank, someone who wasn't tainted with strong views on either side. And someone who we felt had sort of the real drive and passion to get this thing through. So obviously Adair had been leading the CBI, he had that public platform, he had his McKinsey background, so we knew he had the sort of intellectual horsepower.
And he was trusted by the unions, I suppose, as well. He'd done the low pay commission.
Yeah, exactly. So he had that sense of being, he had hit the sweet spot, frankly, of trusted by a range of people, hadn't sort of gone in strong on any particular position, and was seen as trusted by both number 10 and number 11.
Why was that framework chosen of a sort of tight commission of three people?
Well, as the older I get, the more I believe in cock-up over conspiracy in these things. And this was as much from memory about the fact we couldn't agree on more names. So it was not the sense, so you normally had you had the long list, and everyone kept on getting blackballed by one side of number 10 or one side of number 11. We knew we needed someone who could take the unions with us. John obviously had the academic credentials in terms of trying to drive it through. There are a range of other names in play, but they're all seen as either too Blairite, Brownite, or too partisan on different issues. So eventually, given the pressure of time and the last minute nature of it, we sort of landed on the free people.
Can you just say a little bit about how you in number 10 in particular sort of viewed that process of trying to, as it were, to have the commission kind of growing its remit out into wider areas?
So just personally, I left the strategy unit, having finished on the green paper, and then in 2003 joined Downing Street as the pensions and welfare lead. So I sort of saw it from the other side of the house at that point. I think right from the start of the review, number 10 wanted a broad, wide-reaching review of pensions. Blair's view at the time was very much that UK traditionally had seen as having a very successful pension system. That was at risk. There's a big, essentially middle-class concern growing around the collapsing private sector pensions, and he wanted a long-term regime. So he saw this as a big reform agenda, and he wanted to get ahead of it. From my perspective in number 10, it felt the Treasury were in risk management mode. So the terms of reference were very much haggled over, and the focus on private sector pensions was very much a sort of a Treasury insistence at that point. But we were always leaning heavily into Adair, saying, you want to look at this in the round.
Where do you think the sort of Prime Minister started it? Was it through the sense that the private sector market was coming under pressure in the way you've described, and through that mechanism then took him into a wider, a different account of where pensions sat in his welfare policies? Yeah,
I think that's a very good diagnosis of it. It didn't come out of a sort of holistic view of welfare reform. There wasn't a sense in which we were thinking, well, okay, what should be means tested, what should be a sort of more contributory, rights-based system. It came out of the collapse of private pensions. I can't remember the name of the pensions company. I think it was ASW. Frank Field was a big champion. This was a classic manufacturing company, which people's pensions have been wiped out. And Blair took that as as just a fairness issue. As he said, these guys had done the right thing, worked hard, been told the company was putting aside money for their pension, and turned around at 50, 60, and literally were wiped out. So he said, well, hang on, that can't be right. So what's our deal? What's the offer? I think the politics as well, obviously of the 75p rise in the basic state pension, I think in 2000 was still playing through. And you were starting to have private pensions advisors showing real concern about pension credit. Because if you remember, pension credit was brought in on the back of the 75p rise, was made far more generous. And people were asking real questions, especially with people with more fragmented work records, potentially relatively lower levels of private pension, what their advice would be. Was it right? Would it be mis-selling effectively, given the government's commitments to long-term increases in the pensions credit linked to earnings? Would it be mis-selling effectively to advise people to sell into a pension? So all these things came together. But I think Blair very much came to it from a private sector, middle-class perspective. He sort of felt, I'm parodying just to make the point, the pension of poverty issue, whilst not solved, was being solved through the heavy investment that was being happening for the pensioners now. This was very much about sort of the medium to long term.
And I suppose that taking it to the next step then, the Pensions Commission produces its first report, which was to say, this is the problem. Do you think that was a kind of key to then shifting the argument about the solution?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I'd say on that. One is sort of the strategy unit learned from McKinsey, and Adair was McKinsey, so we had a very similar methodology. The natural way in which we approached it was very similar. As you say, a lot of people had dug themselves in on positions. So if you think about where we were when the 2002 Green Paper came out, unions were very clear, no increase in the state pension age. Private sector, CBI, IOD, very clear, no compulsory private pension contributions. Treasury were very clear. We did big reforms in the 80s when we decoupled state pensions from earnings. We don't want to unwind that fiscal risk. So everyone was locked in, but when we went through the analysis, well, there were some very simple options. You can have spend more public money, more private contributions, work longer, or you're going to be poorer in retirement. So that not quite triangle, iron set of trade-offs was helpful. Back on the cock-up over conspiracy, one of the big negotiations in the terms of reference was on the timescales. Blair wanted to move quickly from memory. Brown was very clear he wanted it beyond the election. So he was very clear he wanted the final report beyond 2005. And on that basis, Adair then said, okay, we've got to do an interim report. So in some ways, a sort of the negotiations of the scope, timelines, the desire to push essentially a very difficult issue beyond this electoral cycle, gave the Commission time to do both the intellectual work on setting out the evidence base, but also take the stakeholders with them.
And was Adair a key kind of figure in that, as well as doing the rounds of the stakeholders?
Yeah, he led from the front.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of independent reviews in government. I think we were lucky with Adair in that he had a great mix of skills. Say he had the intellectual capability, knew people, incredibly well networked, and very persuasive. We were small p political.
It's many people's view that the Commission succeeded precisely because it asked something of everybody in return for something. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, no, I thought it was both a nicely judged policy and political package. They, I think where they got to, they did some really interesting work on intergenerational fairness, about sort of the balance to which different generations should be expected to have the same treatment as previous ones, or the way in which the different birth rates played through. I think the way they took the unions on the journey, I think, was incredibly impressive. And similarly on the employer side, using the emerging field of behavioural economics, auto-enrolment, was a clever, and not just a clever way as in politically clever, but I thought a very neat way through the sort of, should we have contributory pensions or not? The auto-enrolment sort of came through, squared that circle in a very smart way.
Were you subject to a lot of lobbying by these different interests? I mean,
that was the vast majority of my job, frankly. Was if I look over the 3-4 years I was in Downing Street, I would estimate I probably spent 40 to 50% of my time on pensions, the rest being on child support agency and incapacity benefit reform at the time.
Right.
But Blair was, in the, I forget what they were called now, the business groups, the business councils he held. That was, pensions was number one issue at the time, mainly about the pension cap and how much executive pensions could be. But that got them into the issue, and they got into it. Both it needed to be reformed, but also concern about employer costs, unions, and it was Rodney Bickerstaff who was leading on this, and the National Pensioners Convention. Was putting a lot of pressure in through the Labour Party political side of the house as well.
So two things just on the Prime Minister then. I mean, the first is seeing this as a kind of legacy issue for himself. I'm going to do a reform that will last. Was it just because he was convinced not just that reform was necessary, but this was a reform where he could leave a lasting legacy? Was it in that kind of category?
So it shifted over time. It went on for a long time. It was 2.5 years, and if you take it right the way through to the white paper was accumulation of it. It was best part, it was over 3 years from start to finish. So there were moments when it really came to the top of the shop. The big hot moments were the November 2004 evidence paper, and the concern then from our side of the house was keeping Adair alive, frankly, as the way we talked about it. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't rubbish by, you can imagine a range of stakeholders, and it wasn't immediately killed as just a sort of infeasible or technocratic. So we wanted to make sure we sort of kept it alive and gave him the space. So I always felt my job, right the way through to the final report, was giving him air cover to try and get to have as broad and fundamental review as possible of the reforms. We did a lot of work with Blair and Brown in the run-up to the final report, and I think it was very much after the 2005 election was when it shifted from this would be a good thing to do, and it was sort of rumbling along in the background. After 2005, we restructured Downing Street. That was a classic, the John Birt third term plan, and shrunk down the policy unit and basically said, okay, what are I think it was half a dozen priorities for your third term, and literally had one advisor on each of them. And that was things, you'll remember things like, it was academies on education, all the various immigration reforms, and on welfare it was pensions. So that was when it turned into a good thing to do, into a legacy issue.
Yeah. And in terms of securing consensus for it, obviously there was a big argument within government about how you would respond to Turner, and this would be something on which you wanted a wider political consensus. So can you just say a little bit about that? Did Blair basically want to bind the Tories and the Lib Dems into this? Did he want this to be something which was hard to shift? And
I think, hard for me to talk about the politics of it, but I think if you look from the public policy aspects, there's a recognition that pensions is a long-term game. And you're effectively trying to create a trusted regime, so effectively people can make informed decisions. Because whereas you can change benefit rules year on year and people change their decisions to work or not, pensions, you've got to make calls now about whether to save on the basis of what you think the regime's going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So his view was always, he's always very good at saying, what would I do? Classic middle class couple living in London, what do I do about my future? And that was his always like, well, and the system's just too complicated. So how do we simplify it, and how do we get it into a place where people can know what the rules of the game are? So he saw it, I'm sure, politically, but also in terms of the public policy, but saying you couldn't just ram this through. You needed to build a sense of this is the right framework.
After Turner, the second report had come out, the main issue within government then was the affordability of of relinking pension, the basic state pension to earnings. Yeah.
And so we had in the the run up to the Turner publishing, because obviously he was starting to test his recommendations, a series of pretty fruity meetings where you had effectively the welfare secretary John Hutton at the time, Blair and Brown arguing the way through some incredible levels of technocratic detail. And you think of everything else going on for the Prime Minister at the time. He was writing the detail. He could quote at various points what the pension would be worth, basic state pension would be worth in 2050, and he could do his real terms and his earnings adjusted. So he really got his barrister mind really got into the numbers on this, and that was the heart of it. The big heart of the debate was classic Treasury position of fiscal black hole, because I think from memory it was about a % of GDP you were talking about in terms of the cost of reforms, versus the argument from my side, which would be, look at what we've done in the last 10 years on pensions. If you forecasted out from 96 state spending on pensions and pensioners versus what actually happened, we kept basically every year we kept on putting more money into state pensions or pension credit or winter fuel payments. So our argument was, rather than constantly just doing top-ups, let's do something strategically and get a long-term basis. And that was the heart of the debate.
And do you think, did Treasury officials kind of come round to that?
These were difficult times. There's always difficult times, if you like, politically. But this was in the run-up to the questions about handovers, and everyone was looking to a Brown regime, and Brown ran the Treasury, with a tight grip. So it was quite hard for the Treasury to show much ankle. It was tough, I guess. Speak to people. I'm sure you speak to people like Nick Mack and others. It ran against some of the sort of what you might call the fiscal side of the Treasury, because they had seen decoupling pension, basic state pension from earnings as the big win and the big reform that put public finances on a sustainable footing. Yeah. So they had a natural, understandable sort of fiscal concern about this.
So reversing that was a big thing for the Treasury to concede.
So you did have a sort of the political line and the official line of the House was not instinctively in the place where Turner was.
And so as you mentioned, the role of behavioural economics is important. So can you just say a little bit about that? How did that kind of thinking come into your thinking and in the thinking of the Turner Commission?
So I think this was around the time that Richard Thaler had been was in Britain, I think, at that point. He'd been doing a bit of work over here. I think it was just before the sort of the Caldini influence. It was an emerging set of people. I think Jeff gets should get more credit on this. He brought a lot of that into the strategy unit. Right. Some of the more earlier, more academic, less popular science literature, if you like, around this, and he certainly brought that in. So there've been debates on it in a slightly more theoretical sense in the strategy unit. Adair was plugged into some of those conversations. But it was interesting in that when you look at the reforms, look at the incredible success of auto-enrolment now, that wasn't where the real argument was. The argument was all around basic state pension, the symbolism of the earnings link, and the pension age. Yeah. That was the sort of heart of the issue. It's not that we ignored the auto-enrolment, but everyone sort of felt, politically anyway, we could also buy that because that gave us enough space to get through. Yeah. So the sort of we did this in two bites as well. So the original 2006 report from Adair, then the white paper, was very much focused on the state system. Yeah. We then had a follow-up white paper on auto-enrolment nest. I think at the time there was still, from memory, and I'll have to go and check, but from memory we sort of focused on auto-enrolment, and remember the pension industry loved that because they saw that as net fund flow. And we kept ambiguity about whether, many countries had made a decision, whether to create nest PADA or not. ABI, Association British Insurers, had their own counter-proposal for how you could do this without a state body. And remember, creating a new state saving institution was not particularly Blairite. I mean, it went against a lot of his instincts and a lot of where he was. So we kept that open. and frankly, because we only had so much political bandwidth to actually grapple with the reform package, and that was all on the state side. Then it took probably a year later until we resolved we came forward with the white paper. We did more work internally ourselves on the different options. So I think we had essentially a sort of carousel model where you could be essentially defaulted into a range of different private providers, but ultimately we went for PADA.
Yeah, and so the other element of the state pension reform then that was important to this was the idea of creating a flat rate second state pension. That too involves some winners and losers. If you're going to get rid of the second state pension or SERPs as it had been, there will be people that will get less and others who will get more. Can you just say a little bit about that?
So we started, I'd say where we started back in with Adair and where Blair's instincts were, you know, as I said, his question was always, what does sort of your classic middle class couple decide what to do about their future? So what he wanted to say is, look, there's going to be a pension that'll get you out of poverty. That's safe, that's guaranteed. It won't be great, but it'll be, you know, you won't be destitute. Then anything you save on top of that is your choice, and that's your choice about whether to spend now or to save for the future. That was his sort of top-down perspective on what the reform package should look like. So the question then was much more around sort of technicalities of the extent to which you could quickly back out of SERPs, and we probably weren't. I think we didn't, because we ran out of, frankly, time and political bandwidth. We would have liked to have been more ambitious in 2006, and I think where we've subsequently got to is very much in line with where Turner would have gone.
Yes.
I think, you know, if anything, looking back, would have liked to accelerate that journey to a single state pension.
Great. So
people were very willing in number 10, certainly at the time, to take the sort of, essentially the losers would have been the sort of the slightly higher paid, longer employment records, for the prize of clarity and certainty and simplicity.
Yeah. So just asking you then as a sort of civil servant about the Turner Commission process and the subsequent reforms. I mean, would you see this as a sort of model of public policy development, which can be learnt from, should be more widely replicated? Is something that, for sort of these bigger long-term challenges, is something that that you could say to future ministers or to other countries, you would recommend that?
Totally. I think there's a lot of contingencies, but I think there's that model of building the evidence base, taking time, so having the facts, but then taking time to take stakeholders with you and recognise it's not just beating people up on the facts, but actually helping people learn themselves about the choices and trade-offs, and then using that as a basis for creating some sort of long-term solution. I think it's incredibly powerful. Now, there's a lot of contingencies. One, there's not many Adairs in the world, so you do have to be a bit lucky on who you pick. I think the one thing I reflect on now is, of course, that was a time of large majorities. So an interesting question with minority administrations, the ease of getting the legislation through Parliament. I don't think we spent any time thinking about the legislative process, which is incredible to me now. But literally, we worked out the white paper, and it was sort of thrown over the fence for James to take through Parliament. We didn't have to think about the tactics of parliamentary handling in the same way we obviously need to do now.